All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to Working Lands of the Laguna Watershed panel discussion. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon. Some of you have probably joined us for some online programs before. You may know the drill. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from today. You can say hello in the chat box. And maybe, for fun for this particular program, you could also share your favorite farm fresh produce that you can get here in Sonoma County, along with your name and where you're tuning in from today. Mix it up a little bit. We will get started here in just a minute. We'll let some more folks join. If you're just joining us, welcome to Working Lands of the Laguna Watershed. This will be a panel discussion, and we will get started. I'll get started with some introductions and a little bit about these organizations here that are partners for this program, and then we'll go ahead and get started. If you're just tuning in, feel free to say hello in the chat box. Zoom is funny. And this is the only way we can really see who's out there with us tonight. All right, so as people continue to join, I'll get started with my introductions and then we'll get into our panel discussion. So my name is Allison Titus. I am the Community Education Manager here at the Laguna Foundation. I will introduce the Laguna Foundation, our partner organizations, and then give you some housekeeping notes to get started before I introduce all the wonderful panelists that we have here with us tonight. So, let's see, advanced slide. Oops, sorry, everybody. There we go. Okay, so the Laguna Foundation is a nonprofit organization based in Santa Rosa, just outside Sebastopol, that works to restore, conserve, and inspire public appreciation for the Laguna de Santa Rosa wetlands. There are a lot of ways to describe the Laguna and our work. The Laguna is a wetland and a 22-mile-long waterway, as well as an entire watershed. If you live in Cotati, Rohnert Park, Santa Rosa, or Windsor, you live within the Laguna watershed. And the Laguna de Santa Rosa faces important issues that drive our restoration, conservation, and education work today. In more modern history, it has gone from being described as devoid of life in the 1970s to being designated as a wetland of international importance in 2011 because of the incredible biodiversity found here, especially the migrating birds along the Pacific Flyway and the rare species that we have in our vernal pool ecosystems. Even with that incredible designation, there's a lot of work to be done. The Laguna of today still has poor water quality, high amounts of introduced species that threaten the biodiversity that make it special, and many people don't know why the Laguna is so important or even where it is, even though it sustains over 250,000 people in Sonoma County in addition to the plants and animals. We are dedicated specifically to conserving this dynamic watershed and the varied history it encompasses, and working to restore wetland habitat, manage those introduced species, improve water quality through tracking sediment and restoring creek banks, and educating and inspiring future generations so that the Laguna is a place for all to enjoy and protect for years to come. We do this with our partners, some of whom are here tonight, who share common goals, such as protecting land for the future, improving watershed health, and educating the public about the incredible natural and working lands of this county. This program is made possible with your public support of these initiatives and organizations like the Sonoma Resource Conservation District and Sonoma Ag Open Space. And finally, it's important to note that for this particular panel, working lands are an important and characteristic part of our watershed and our organization. This history is evident at our organization's home base on Stone Farm, which is protected by a conservation easement from Sonoma Ag Open Space. If you've ever visited us there, you've seen how interconnected we are with the agricultural history of this area. As you can see in this photo, or maybe you've seen yourself, our office is a renovated farmhouse from the 1800s. And there's a lot of old vintage, agricultural machinery on our site. Our restoration team works in a renovated dairy milking shed. And of course, we have an old hop barn on our site that reminds us of the variety of different crops that have been farmed here, while also hosting our resident barn owls. That's something I particularly love about them, and bats. So we are really connected to this particular feature of our landscape here in Sonoma County. And I hope this panel increases your appreciation for the deep connection we have to working lands and their role in our shared watershed. So, a lot of you have probably spent more time than you ever imagined you would on Zoom, and you might be experts at this point, but just in case there are some Zoom newbies out there, here's a couple housekeeping notes for a successful webinar experience. Please add your questions through the panel and say hello in the chat box. If you haven't found it, you just hover your cursor over the bottom of your Zoom screen and it'll pop up. If you want everyone to see your comment or your question, you will want to select the little gray drop down that says chat to all panelists and attendees. If you have just a question for the panelists specifically, which would be any of the folks you see on the side of your Zoom screen, you can select all panelists. We will have time for some questions at the end. However, given the number of panelists and the wealth of experience on this panel, we may not have time to get to all of your questions. So you can reach out to me if you have a burning question at the end of the panel, and I may be able to follow up with you via email. So I want to give a special thank you to all of our panelists for being here today and taking time out of their busy schedules to have this candid discussion with all of us. I also want to acknowledge and thank the Sonoma Ag and Open Space for their support for this program, which allows this program to be free to the public. And their support also includes lending their expertise on this topic. Misti is here with us from Sonoma Ag and Open Space. I also want to give a special thank you to the Sonoma RCD. This program would not be possible without their logistical help, their connections, and their support in moderating. So we are so fortunate to have an excellent moderator and wonderful panelists here with us today. These folks all have different relationships and roles when it comes to the working lands of this watershed. There is an incredible variety of knowledge and expertise on this panel, and I am very excited and honored to introduce Valerie, Misti, Doug, and Stuart to you before we get started. Still, bear with me here. This is a long intro, but there is so much to share about each of these folks, and I want you to know a little bit more about where they're coming from. I'll start with Valerie, our moderator. Valerie has over 12 years experience in the field of natural resources and has developed a strong background in ecology, water quality, agricultural conservation, and public policy, which is a background that lends itself super well to this particular panel and the work we all do here. Valerie began her service at the RCD in 2008, and over the years, she's played many different roles on the team, gaining experience in a bunch of different program areas, as well as operations, finance, and fundraising. And in 2017, she was selected as the RCD's executive director. So now in this role, she oversees the day-to-day functions while providing direction for the future, building partnerships, and advocating for the RCD at the local, state, and federal levels. And she works in partnership with the board of directors and the entire RCD team. She's also a lifelong Sonoma County resident, and she holds a BS from Sonoma State and is very active in the community around here. She's also serves as the vice chair of the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. So thank you, Valerie, for being here to help moderate and guide the conversation between all of our panelists. And I'd love to introduce our panelists a little more that are here with us tonight. First, we have Misti. Misti is the acquisition manager at the Sonoma County Open Space District. Ag and Open Space was created and funded by a local voter initiative to protect a wide variety of land throughout Sonoma County. And since 1990, Ag and Open Space has permanently protected over 117,000 acres of land. As acquisition manager, Misti oversees a wide variety of land conservation efforts for local agriculture, green belts, recreation, and wildlife habitat. She has nearly 25 years of land conservation experience, ranging from small-scale community farms to landscape-scale conservation easements on wild lands. And moving right along, we have Doug here with us tonight, Doug Beretta. Doug was born on the family dairy ranch in Sonoma County, in Santa Rosa, where he's worked most of his life. The ranch has been in his family since 1948, when his grandfather purchased it and moved his dairy cattle to Santa Rosa from Petaluma. He is the third generation to own and operate the dairy, which is amazing. In 2006, he transitioned the dairy to 100% organic and started shipping milk to a yogurt company. And then that company was sold, and now they ship milk to Clover. His family is also super active in the dairy, including his wife, Sharon, and 3 children, Jennifer, Lisa, and Ryan. And he also included that he has a grandson as well, who's 9 years old. He is also, like Valerie, super active in the community and is involved in Ag Days, sponsored by the Sonoma County Farm Bureau, where he enjoys educating school children and adults about the dairy industry and the importance of agriculture in Sonoma County. He's also been a board director of the Sonoma County Farm Bureau, including president in 2007 and 2008. And he's also served on the Sonoma County Tiger Salamander Task Force as an agriculture representative for 5 years. Currently, he's the chairman of the Animal Resource Management Committee. This committee works hand in hand with Region 1 and Region 2 water quality boards dealing with manure management from all types of animal agriculture. So super range of expertise here. Doug, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to hear more about some of this tonight. And finally, we have Stuart Schroeder here with us. Stuart is a longtime Laguna de Santa Rosa and Stone Farm steward, as well as a farm equipment operator and adjunct instructor at SRJC's Shone Farm. He has served on the advisory council at the Laguna Foundation and is a huge part of the history of the Laguna Environmental Center, its creation, its vision, and what it is today. And my colleague Brent, he was one of the folks who recommended Stuart for this panel, and he said, quote, "Stuart has a thoughtful approach to just about anything related to land use and farming. Plus, his background in habitat restoration is next to unheard of in the farming world. He does a great job explaining and teaching," which I thought was, convinced me. I gotta get Stuart to be a part of this. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here this evening. I look forward to learning from all of you and hearing what you have to say about this topic that's so important and interconnected to our work here at the Laguna Foundation. I'm going to hand it over to Valerie to get us started with this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Allison. Thank you for those lovely and thorough introductions. I learned new things about folks that I've worked with for a while, so that was great. I'm going to go through kind of some questions that we've prepared for all of our panelists, and sort of start with Doug and Stuart's perspective as agriculturalists and land managers, and then we'll go to Misti for the Ag and Open Space perspective. So I think we'll start off on the first question. We can start with Doug, and then Doug can hand it over to Stuart. And the first question is, as a farmer or land manager, how do you see your relationship with the land? So we'll start with Doug.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for having me on this panel. So as a farmer land manager, I think the biggest thing for me is the land has been, in our family for 3 generations. I think back to stories that my grandfather told about, things that he did when he moved up here from Petaluma. He was very proactive, especially with manure management type things. He built manure ponds on our dairy in the early 60s before the Clean Water Act, because he knew the value of that manure, what it meant to put it back on the land, plus to keep it out of the waterways. The relationship for me has just been, over years watching this ranch, trying to improve the growing ability of our grasses. We've utilized the reclaimed wastewater from the city of Santa Rosa to irrigate for now almost 40 years. To me, that means that, we've been one of the biggest water recyclers in the county. I utilize about 80 million gallons a year to irrigate. And if I have to pull that out of the ground, I just think back to where that aquifer would be today. That's what's been such a huge benefit to that water, to the dairy industry. Also, as my daughter Jennifer graduated from Chico State, when we transitioned our dairy to organic, going to a lot of conferences and starting to see what, the differentials between compost putting on and the carbon sequester that we do as animal agriculture with green grass. And as we were speaking earlier with some of the panelists about, the oak trees that we have here, watching them grow older and, seeing the new stuff too. And even just seeing the amount of wildlife that is now on our farm that was not here before, as the towns have increased and started to push into the ag areas. We're seeing, deer, tons of wild turkeys, the coyotes, the mountain lions, the things like that, we're all trying to farm with in different ways, but we have to be very careful about certain things with those animals too that would affect some of the animals that we raise. That's about it for me.
Well, hi, I'm Stuart. Thanks again for having me on the panel. I have been an annual crop farmer. So part of our process, of course, is disturbing the soil every year. And, that has ramifications to water quality as well as soil health. So I have been, I like to think of myself as somebody who observes, pays attention, and I have been watching carefully what my actions have caused or might cause on the soil and the surrounding environment. And one of the things that I've really tried to keep in the background of all of my actions is the adage to do no damage, or do as little damage as results from annual tillage. But I consider myself a caretaker, and growing crops to nourish people is the goal. But concurrently with that goal, I believe that I want to nourish the residents of this place, which the birds that move through, the animals, not the gophers. Leave them out of the picture here, but so we've been planting hedgerows and more permanent borders that animals that are helping us can retreat to when the disturbances occur, for us to grow these crops for people. So I know as a human, I'm moving through the landscape as a disturbing force, but I want to mitigate that and minimize that as much as possible. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Stuart. So moving on to Misti, in your role at Ag and Open Space, how do you see your relationship with the land?
Thanks, Valerie. I'm also super happy to be here, so thanks for having me. Well, it's funny, being in land conservation, land is kind of everything, right? So it is the key to the work that we do. We see that we have a tagline that we use, land for life, meaning that basically land is the foundational element of survival of all communities, human and natural. Like you were just mentioning, it nurtures human communities, but it's also essential for the survival of our natural communities. So that is our primary focus, basically making sure that land is available and not converted to such intensive uses that it cannot recover, or at least in any time soon. So our goal is to protect land so that it's available for farming, it's available for natural communities, it's available for folks to recreate on and enjoy, and get all the health benefits that provides all of us by being outside and being in nature, and creating these natural spaces that can help us be more resilient to catastrophic events that we're getting a lot more accustomed to, like fire, and also to have enough land available for adaptation to climate change as that happens over time. So it's basically fundamentally everything to us as an organization, and super, super dear to my heart personally.
Thank you. That's lovely. Land is everything. We can probably all agree on that foundational wisdom. So Stuart and Doug, you both spoke a little bit to, as you talked about your work on the land, your approach to land management, you both spoke a little bit already to management practices, things like trying to grow more grass and sequester more carbon, trying to find ways to do less damage with tillage. But I'm wondering now, and I think we'll start with Stuart and then go to Doug, if you can talk any more about kind of how your practices have changed over time, how your practices in managing the land, and any deeper that you'd like to go into those kinds of stories of land management practices that are used to contribute to a healthy watershed. So we'll start with Stuart.
Well, just to put a little perspective on this, I was farming here at Stone Farm for about 20 years. I now work at Shone Farm as their farm equipment operator, and there are more, or should say, different things that I'm doing now at Shone that I didn't have the opportunity to do here at Stone and Shone. One at Shone Farm that I'm involved with is we have 80 acres of irrigated pasture at Shone Farm, and we are working on a carbon sequestration roadmap, so to speak, with that involving rotational grazing, and I'm actually currently no-till drilling a new irrigated pasture mix into the old pasture, which has become invasive with grasses, or invaded with grasses and forbs that the cattle don't particularly like. But we've also just this fall have discovered that we have some serious head cuts happening in those pastures, and so the management team and myself are working to correct those head cuts. And if any of you all have experience with head cuts, you know they're not very forgiving. They don't rest. So these are things that we're dealing with right now. When I was farming here at Stone Farm for myself, I was always cognizant of the impending rains, and usually attempted to get my cover crops in by October 15th or November 1st. And so we could have some growth on those cover crops to help hold the soil when the winter rains began. Other than that, crop varieties, growing things for pollinators and not just people. Some of the things that I have done and we are doing.
Thanks, Stuart. And it sounds like a really major theme for you has been just kind of soil management, head cuts being that erosion feature of soil and cover crops being a way to protect soil. So I think that's something that maybe folks that haven't been part of farming haven't thought so much about. Soil, a lot of us think of soil as dirt, but when that's a resource to be protected, it really, you can think of it differently. So thanks for sharing those examples of managing soil. And Doug, how about you?
Well, I think, I have to kind of we've done a lot of things that Stuart has talked about too. I mean, we've been permanent irrigated pasture for, almost 40 years. We also do some regular tillage for our silage crops and hay crops. But as we, have moved into a lot of the newer technologies and things like that, we're seeing that no-tilling into the soil has become, really, really big here in the Laguna. We're actually, Stuart, same thing. We're no-tilling in some dry pasture. One of the things that's really interesting at Beretta Dairy is we have to farm with 3 endangered flowers and the endangered tiger salamander. So we have over 100 acres that we cannot actually go in and till. We can graze it as dry pasture or spring pasture, but we've had those species there, and they're still there and they're still thriving, even with the cattle being in there grazing all the time. So those are some areas that we're starting to look at, some no-till seeding to continue the grasses growing that will support the agriculture, but still will help that those endangered species. We're not down in the pools, but up in the uplands. Manure management has always been, number one at Beretta Dairy, going back, as I said earlier, my grandfather built the first manure ponds in like 1964, I think it was. And I think about, a lot of people see the dairies and they see these big barns go up and the cows, the freestall barns where the cows are kept inside during the winter. But, everybody thinks, oh, they're kept in there for, just locked up. But that is the number one thing for manure management. When I was a kid, we didn't have a freestall barn, and there were huge piles of shavings that the cows laid on outside. And by the time those cows got through the middle of the winter and walked from those piles of shavings to the dairy barn, they were in mud to their bellies and the sick cows that we had. And so we built the first freestall barn in 1974. And then we built another bigger one in 1997. And we can house almost 80% of our animals under roof during the wintertime, which is huge for the environment. We're not getting erosion from the cattle out there walking, tearing pastures up. And so that's been, one of those things that for us on a kind of a practice, that's always been a really good thing. Some of the other things that, I've been real instrumental in looking is I'm always kind of reaching out, seeing what grants are available. We were awarded in February of 2019, we were awarded an AMP grant, which is an alternative manure management grant. And we are about 3/4 of the way through our process right now. We're building a new building. We're putting in automatic scrapers in our freestall. We're putting a pump in and a separator that we will separate that manure keep it out of the lagoon. It'll be separated down to about 34% moisture, and we'll turn around and use that bedding back for the cows to sleep on. So we won't be buying sand and purchasing sand that comes into the dairy that we use and then put back out in the fields. So I'm going to have this ability to also compost that manure. We're going to save, hundreds of gallons of diesel a year between the tractors running plus the equipment to fertilize that, put that out in the ground fertilizing. Also, I've received a Healthy Soils grant this year, and that's where the no-tilling We're doing some no-tilling. We've done some compost application. So we're just kind of getting into that. But I think in the long run, that's going to be, you know, one of those really big things for agriculture, to show that carbon sequestration that you know, agriculture does daily. And, you know, I think people from the outside looking in have really got to start to understand that agriculture is, you know, one of the best things for Sonoma County. We have green grass, we have open space, we have habitat for endangered species, we have habitat for, you know, other species also. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. That's great. I mean, I think you built on Stuart's point or kind of theme of soil management, but then I also just really want to kind of re-highlight the theme of manure management that you brought up, because that's been something that I've learned, you know, not just, I guess, from dairy producers in general, but really from you over the last decade or so of my life, is just, you know, how really complex and important manure management is at a dairy, not just as something that could be thought of as a waste product or something you have to manage, but as something that's really a resource and a tool you can use in your farming operation to put back into the land and back into the operation. So I'm glad that you touched on some of that for the folks that are tuned in here. We'll go over to Misti and ask kind of the same question, but a little bit different. In your role at Ag and Open Space, protecting land, are there particular management practices that you're encouraging folks to do on the lands that you've protected in order to help with watershed health?
Well, I would start out by saying, you know, after hearing, you know, Stuart and Doug talk about the detailed approach to their caring for the land and making adjustments to their agricultural practices, you could see very much that in the work we do, quite often the landowners and the operators know the land the best and have you know, evolved over time to some of the things they've been seeing. And so we often take the approach of trying to help provide resources to landowners that they may need to modify their practices in ways that they've been interested in doing and haven't been able to do so. We work really closely with the RCDs, and Valerie and I are on a steering committee for a federal grant called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, where the focus is to have protected lands also benefit from working with local RCDs to develop conservation plans or land smart plans on their properties, really guided by the landowner and their needs and their interests and what they want to enhance and change, and then help bring in resources to implement those projects. So I would say that's primarily the role we play in helping to provide resources to landowners. Also, just the fact that when we purchase conservation easements, at that moment, it's an opportunity to generate significant amounts of money that can be invested back into the operation. And that quite often is done in a manner that results in enhancements that Doug has been talking about, and Stuart as well. And so a lot of it is us just providing resources. We aren't the absolute experts in land management. I would say, and then the other side of it is that conservation easements are restrictive in nature, right? They aren't really intended to tell people how to manage land. They're intended to restrict certain uses and practices and developments that will impact the land in a way it can't be available for certain types of conservation values we're seeking to protect. Often agriculture itself is one of those values. And so we will, you know, work with the landowner to identify if there are sensitive resources on site, something that Doug's been talking about, endangered species, and grazing is usually perfectly acceptable in those situations, and we'll work with the landowner on those types of things. Like it could be seasonal or not when there are particular risks to the species. So, but much more in a restricting certain types of uses and not prescribing types of management. And I would say that, you know, we do have a permanent relationship with landowners, because conservation easements, we often, in our office, we've been talking about this a lot lately, that the acquisition program basically just records a document. You know, once that's done, everybody's like, oh, protected, you know, it's done. But really that piece of paper isn't protecting the land or looking out for the interest that we invested public dollars in. And so our stewardship staff has a perpetual relationship with landowners, and over time goes out and visits these properties and works with landowners. And so, if there are particular items that seem like they're of concern, we can raise them, identify resources for folks, not punitively, but more in a like trying to work together to have corrective action. And then also just be a resource when somebody has something of interest that they're wanting to seek to do on their land, but they don't know exactly how to start. Get them in touch with folks who do know how to start.
That's great. Well, I think hearing, as you kind of noted early on, hearing from Doug and Stuart about their land management really underscores the wisdom of that approach of, relying on farmers and ranchers and other agriculturalists as the experts in managing their land for those benefits, and then also, being a resource to make sure that land is protected in perpetuity. So it's great. This question kind of builds on some things that have already been mentioned, but I think we can go deeper. Doug talked a little bit about the challenges on at least one piece of the property of working in an area with 3 endangered flowers plus California tiger salamander, and those are just some examples of the kind of dynamic and sensitive nature of the Laguna watershed as a system. So can't remember what order we went. I think we started with Stuart last time, so we can start with Doug this time. To see if you can talk any more about any unique challenges to farming in the Laguna watershed versus just kind of the general challenges of farming in the world. And so we'll start with Doug and go to Stuart.
Well, I mean, I think the Laguna is, it's a unique area. But if you're following best management practices, which most farms do throughout California, throughout the world, I think, that's one thing that a lot of people just see us doing things that don't have the expertise in farming and think we're out there doing something wrong, when it's really something that's benefiting the Laguna, benefiting the land. One of probably the biggest things for us has always just been what I call clean water diversion. That would be making sure we're capturing roof water, water off of our roads, our driveways, things like that, and making sure that we're getting that water away from manured areas, so we don't have the problems of ponds running over or manure getting into the county ditches and then down into the Laguna. We have Roseland Creek that runs right through the middle of our ranch. It was at one time it was a man-made flood control channel. As they started to build here in Santa Rosa area, in the Hearn Avenue area, that area used to be about 1 foot deep, and we irrigated across it back in the 60s. And then in 1974 they built this huge channel for flood control, and now it's been turned into, now it has a name as Roseland Creek, which that's a challenge for us because it's become a blue line stream that runs through it. Our cattle cross it on rocked fenced crossings. It's fenced off, but it really becomes a challenge of how you manage that to stay current with water quality rules, fish and game rules, and things like that. So I think those are the things you have to be involved in a lot of meetings, a lot of committees, working with the RCDs, working with Ag and Open Space, I think is huge, because there are those opportunities for the dollars, as Misti said, that can be put out there to help farmers continue to grow and continue to be, to continue to be follow the regulations, I guess you should say. So I guess that's all in right there. I mean, really, we're not doing a lot of really non-normal farming practices. You just really have to watch what you're doing and where you're doing it.
My turn. I would add that one of the challenges that we're all facing is drought. Fortunately, we have use of reclaimed water to keep our pastures green and throughout the summer months. But that water runs out too, and it's running out earlier and earlier in the year. Farmers are getting cut off or allotted a certain amount of water from that reclaimed system, the Santa Rosa reclaimed system, and also the Windsor, as Shone Farm is on the Windsor reclaimed system. So that's a challenge. Living with drought is a serious challenge, and I think culturally we're used to just having as much water as we want, not just us farmers, but everybody, you know. And so I think that's something that we're going to really have to come to terms with. They're really coming to terms with it in the Central Valley. We've got a little bit more of a, my understanding is this a little bit more of a flexible system here on the coast. We get a pretty good dose of rain when the rain does come, and we have this reclaimed water. But the larger farms in the Central Valley have been mining the water from the aquifers, and the aquifers are dropping, and less snowpack means less water. But they're not the only ones using the water. There's a lot of users. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. One of the small things that I've done with my wife Denise is we've got some native plants in hedgerows, which I think are more drought resistant, of course, than much of the stuff we're trying to irrigate for food. And that is food for wildlife, birds, and whatnot. So perennializing some of these border areas, I think, is a good plan.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm picking out kind of another theme from both Doug and Stuart's answers here about, you know, lots of different but related issues, and really how our agricultural lands and the people that farm them really are connected to these bigger community issues. You know, being part of a recycled water system, being being concerned about water quality and where you're tackling water quality issues, and the animal resource committee work that Doug does to, you know, make sure that the water quality is monitored, and looking at groundwater management. It's really, I think, a hallmark of Sonoma County agriculture, actually, the way agriculture is part of our community and part of these collaborative systems. You know, not off having a separate conversation, but really part of the bigger issues that are in our watersheds, and not just making sure that their land is resilient, but also doing things like, you know, planting perennial plants to be feeding wildlife, or, you know, those kinds of measures that are really important to the larger landscape. So really great to hear about kind of how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together in the watershed and on these lands. And then Misti's follow-on question it also follows a little bit of what you talked about in the last question about kind of specifically protecting agricultural values versus other values you might be protecting on land. So can you talk a little more about how your approach to protecting ag land, or the work of protecting ag land, might be different from other types of land?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it's interesting because agriculture is, you know, usually thought of as a use, and so I think people are focusing on us protecting a use, but our focus is really on protecting the land so that it's available for, you know, people to use for agriculture. And so we are on agricultural projects particularly. I think we have to provide a lot of flexibility, because And you folks can talk about this way better than I can. For generations of agriculture, there's a lot of evolution over time, right? There's evolution in market conditions, or in the landscape itself, or somewhat in climate and water availability. And the agricultural community has to be able to adjust to those things. And so we have to try really hard not to make the easements so restrictive in the types of uses that would be allowed on the land that we're focusing on, that they wouldn't be able to adjust and still be able to produce food for the community and also be economically viable. So I'd say that's the primary difference, is that they allow for a lot more commercial use, but it's really specifically to agricultural production. And but I'm gonna, on the other hand, many of our easements are multifaceted, and we really like to leverage the public dollars that we're spending in many ways. And one of the ways that we can do that is to work with landowners that are willing to protect their land or interested in that, to achieve multiple public benefits in one location. And so it's quite often that our agricultural partners and landowners are interested in those other features as well. So it's quite often that properties where we're primarily protecting them so that they're available for ag production in the future also may have like clustered oak woodlands that are beneficial to wildlife. And the landowner themselves, we were just talking about oak woodlands actually with Doug, and that their family, honors and respects those oaks and wants them to stay there as well. So there are factors on the landscapes that are agriculturally based that have other public benefits. Scenic, the community at large is incredibly tied to the fact that we're a rural county. It's one of the things we hear all the time from the public. Like, even if it's just driving down country roads and seeing the vistas with cows, it is really important to the people who live here. And so that is a public benefit. So the other types of easements, I would say, our easements kind of run the gamut from, like I was just suggesting, maybe agricultural and commercial use or recreational use, where there is an intention to have more human use of the land, all the way through lands that are really intended to just be, available to wildlife, basically to survive and thrive. And those easements are much more restrictive, obviously. So those easements don't allow a lot of any kind of development or fencing or things that have impacts to wildlife movement and habitat connectivity. That there are some wide-ranging species in Sonoma County that need, hundreds, if not thousands of miles of connected habitat. So we try to make sure that there's permeability in those easements, and all water courses and soil and water, surface and subsurface waters are protected. So there's just a lot more restrictive provisions in easements that are focused on protecting natural systems and the way they function kind of on their own. They don't really need, they would allow for restoration because obviously some places have been highly impacted. But I would say that's kind of the primary difference. And then the last piece I'd like to point out is that we also do work with commercial forestry operators. And it's funny because in this county, that's not really considered agriculture. Some folks have a hard time with that, but where it's a similar approach, where landscapes that have just endless natural benefits, carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, watershed benefits, also have selective harvests or something of that nature, where there are harvests allowed that actually can have benefits to forest health and management, because many of the forests have been harvested in a way in the past that they're kind of densely populated. So there's fire benefits, there's health benefits. The trees are going to be basically released to grow bigger and faster and sequester more carbon. And so selling trees that are removed while trying to benefit the forest conditions can help generate revenue that helps improve the health of the land. So we do also have easements where we focus on provisions that allow for that type of use as well.
Thanks, Misti. And I think, I see some questions popping up in the chat, so I want to make sure we have time for those, but I have one last question for this group. And some of what you said, Misti, led really well into it, because you highlighted a variety of public benefits of working lands and agricultural lands. And I think many of the folks on this who are tuned into this webinar are maybe predisposed to think that supporting agriculture is a good thing because they, at the very least, value their clover butter, for example, which I love me some clover butter too. So with starting from that premise that it's really important to support local agriculture, I think we'll start with Stuart and then go to Doug to ask the question, how can Sonoma County residents support local farmers that work with conservation and the environment in mind? So we'll start with Stuart.
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, I'd say it doesn't really address the conservation environment, but supporting local farmers is, farmers markets, locally produced food. But the one thing that I thought of was that if there was, this is a program, it would be a program, if there was some kind of a conservation certification, some kind of attachment to your farm, that announced that to the public in some way or another. But other than that, good question.
That's great. Thank you. How about you, Doug?
Well, I think this county is huge, supporting farmers with local markets, and that's been one of the things around here for years and years, buy local. But in my view, I think county residents can really support agriculture and the farmers by, getting the true information before you jump to a conclusion. There are things that I do on my farm. I've had the animal activists in front of my farm put me all over Facebook telling me I'm raising my calves wrong. I've been doing this since I was 14 years old. 41 years I've been raising calves. And why is it somebody that has no experience with an animal that can tell me how to, what I should be doing? Same thing with the land. Same thing with my farming practices. Instead of jumping to those conclusions, as Misti kind of said, we think about agriculture as this big booming business that all we're out there doing is to make a profit. Well, we have to make a profit if you want us to stay here. We have to pay the property tax, we have to pay our employees, and we have to live also. So if we're out there doing something on our farm, 99.9% of the time, it is something that is going to benefit the farm, benefit the environment, and probably benefit the community. As I said before, did I want to spend, $400,000 and build a freestyle barn? No, I didn't, but I did it for my cows. I did it for my milk quality. I did it for the environment. And, those are things that we do as farmers that I think people that don't have any true relationship with the agriculture community can understand. So instead of jumping to those conclusions, get involved. Sonoma County Farm Bureau is a great place. You become a member and get the information. CAF, there's all the small farmer groups. There's all kinds of groups in this county that can teach you about agriculture. Don't be afraid to pull into a farm and ask for a tour or ask those things. When my daughter, as I said, when my daughter graduated from Chico State, one of the biggest things I wanted to do was start doing tours on our farm, until I went to the county and found out, I could have 3 major events a year. I had to have ADA compliant bathrooms. And by the time I figured it out, I had $150,000 into something that I didn't know if it would generate me any cash at all. We're not, we may be land rich, but we aren't rolling in dough. Everybody thinks a farmer is just this big rich cowboy, as people say, and that's not what we are. We are tied to this land. There are probably many of us that would not be here with all the restrictions that we deal with in California. We could go a lot of other places, but we have ties to this land. 3rd generation on this land. I think about stories of my grandfather paid $48,000 for this ranch, and he used to tell me how he couldn't sleep at night to make the payment. Now I have the fourth generation of my children, and even the fifth, my 9-year-old grandson, that's probably going to be the best dairyman out there because he just loves the cows and he loves the land. And those are things that people have to really think about before you start pointing your fingers at the agriculture people. And it's all commodities. It's not just dairy. It's every agriculture commodity in this county is here for a reason. And as Misti said, there are times we have to make changes. Did we want to see all the apples go away and turn into grapes? No, but those guys have to pay the property taxes. They found it. You know, I mean, look in the Central Valley, the amount of nuts, trees, and things like that that are coming along, and all of our hay ground that we buy hay, so much hay out of the Sacramento Valley, that's all disappearing now to nuts because it's able to make more money. You're able to pay the property taxes and you're able to pay for all the California restrictions. When you go to other states, you have hardly anything that California has. And we still continue to farm here, and we still continue to have the open space, the ability to farm with endangered species, plus all the other benefits that agriculture brings. So, long story short.
Well, it's a great sort of full circle comment, Doug, especially because I think it's such a good point that just learning about agriculture and seeking to understand is a way to support agriculture. And what's great is that the folks that have tuned into this webinar are here to do just that. And so, you know, it's great. Everyone who's taking their time to listen to this conversation, and then the panelists who are taking your time to participate in that conversation. I think it's just a great example of kind of what it takes to build that understanding in the community, understanding and support. So,
and I think that's also, you know, where Ag and Open Space, the RCDs, the NRCS, all those things come into play with agriculture in this community. You know, without your guys' help, it would be really tough to do a lot of the things that we get to do as agriculture.
thanks.
Yeah, farming is it's a pay to play kind of operation. I mean, you know, you've got to juggle millions of dollars just to make a middle class income. You know, it's tough, and you can't be here unless you want to be here, or you shouldn't be here unless you want to be here. And I think the people who are farming here want to be here, and they want to stay as much as possible. When you finally can't do it, you know, it's a sad thing. It's a real sad thing.
Yeah. Well, speaking of juggling funding to support agriculture, Misti, can you, I think you've spoken to it a little bit, but can you elaborate more on both how Ag and Open Space supports agriculture in Sonoma County? And then I'm also really curious if you've heard about, if in your work with agriculture, you've heard about kind of gaps that there are that you wish Ag and Open Space could support, but you can't, and you wish somebody else would, you know, some other organization or community members would step up to do it. So, yeah.
Yes, we have, I would say, I think I've talked, you know, about the ways that we work with Ag. We just did a series of public meetings in development of our Vital Lands initiative. And through that process, we did hear a lot from, well, hundreds of members of the community, but also a diversity of agriculture, and highlighted some areas that I think that we could do better. And actually, there's a question in the chat about helping, you know, folks trying to get into farming. Breaking into farming in Sonoma County is really hard because land value is so high. And so conservation easements by nature can reduce the value of land, so we can help make land more affordable. Without getting too technical, there are times where there's not a lot of like development rights that create a lot of value in the conservation easement. Maybe the land isn't subdividable. And so those situations, like smaller scale farms, we have struggled with what's the best way for us to participate to make these lands that have been farmed for generations, but are transitioning out of maybe a farming family and are at risk of being sold and converted to another use, how do we help keep those lands in agriculture and help transition them to farmers who don't have the capital to buy millions of dollars of property? And it's not an easy issue. And so we've been talking a lot about, helping, but there are programs called buy, protect, resell. So one of the biggest issues is if a property comes up on the market, then it's competitive, right? And somebody who has a lot more money than you may buy the property, and then ag doesn't have a chance at it while they're trying to generate the revenue needed. And we might be able to do programs where we buy the property and then resell it with a conservation easement to an ag buyer. There are programs across the country that do this kind of work. And then they basically record or limit all future sales to ag value, so that it never again is resold at some other more expensive or higher value use. The problem in Sonoma County is that many of these areas that have very rich soil for cultivation, the most valuable use is agriculture because vineyard land is worth so much money. And so that makes it really hard for us to help create that gap in value. So we're working through that, and we're open to hearing if anybody has ideas about like some of the best ways we can do that. And so what I would say is we get asked all the time about us buying and owning land and then just leasing it, making it available to folks who could afford farming leases but can't afford to buy the land. And we weren't really created to own and operate property. We don't have provisions in our expenditure plan, which highlights how we can spend money to perpetually manage property. And so it's a limitation for us that I really wish that gap could be filled. We not long ago put out a request for proposals for an incubator farm on a property that we own. And we didn't get anybody really interested in owning and operating a farm that would be a training ground for folks interested in getting into farming. So incubator farm, if folks don't know what that's about, you can mention that in the chat and we can talk about it. But we don't have the capacity, the skill set or expertise to do that work. So if there were organizations locally who could kind of bridge that gap, we can help make sure the land's available. But if other folks could help do the transition and the training and the operating of some of these places, it would be incredibly helpful. I've talked with Evan Wigg at CAF a lot about like establishing a co-op or something where maybe a much larger piece of property, much easier for us to reduce the value of a much bigger piece of property because that property may be subdivided in the future and we could basically buy away all those rights. So the easement's worth a lot of money. And a lot of these farmers don't want that much land. And so if there were a co-op who would operate a much bigger site, but folks could have 10-acre portions of the co-op, they could share equipment. Anyway, folks who could help with those pieces would be amazing. And then also we do have, ranchers and farmers who are interested in doing like riparian restoration projects and enhancement, and we can't fund the enhancement of private property. It's a complicated issue with public money, the way that we were created. And so we can work with the RCDs and we can try to go after grants, but if there were private funding sources, so one of the things we've been talking about is looking into other funding sources to create like in Marin, there's the Marin Agricultural Land Trust has funding available for on-site enhancement and improvement of the land, and we can't provide that funding. So it'd be great if we had some kind of a partner or other funding source that could do that.
Great, thanks, Misti. I think we can go now to the questions that are in the chat. And Allison, I don't know if I've got the chat up. I don't know if you'd like me to just read those. Okay. So there was one question in the chat, what is a head cut? And I just want to direct folks to a few lines down. Stuart gave a great description of water coursing unhindered, creating gullies and sending soil into streams. So I think that's a good clarification on that one. The next question I think would be really a good question for both Doug and Stuart, because I think you might each be connected with a sort of different circles of ag land managers. The question is, do you feel your fellow ag land managers share the same interest and knowledge of these best practices that benefit both farm production and watershed ecology? Or is there a need for more education and outreach? So I see that Stuart is already unmuted. So maybe I'll start and see if Stuart, if you have any thoughts on that, about kind of the widespread nature of knowledge and interest in these BMPs we talked about earlier.
I don't. Land managers, there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
The ones I know are very interested in these things. But you know, if you drive around to the Sonoma County on a heavy rainfall day, and you look at the rills and rivulets that are flowing towards the creeks, they're not clear. It's not clear water that's running off of land. So there is plenty of education to be spread around. But you know, a lot of people are spreading their erosion control right now. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people are probably doing that because they care, and some people are doing it because it's required. I generally feel that, you know, the laws are there because people either didn't care or just didn't know. But I like to hang out with the cool land managers. So. People who think like me, right? That's what we all do.
Well, thanks, Stuart. I think Doug hangs out with some cool land managers too. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Doug, about knowledge and interest of BMPs.
Well, I think, you know, the knowledge of BMPs has increased so much in probably the last 20 years. I think that kind of what Stuart said, you know, a lot of people think they've done a great job, but they really don't. When it's raining, they're not out there watching the water run off the land. And so, you know, it's as long as it's not a huge erosion gully or whatever come next spring, you know, I think some guys really don't think they had a problem. But as we have, especially in the dairy industry, in Sonoma County, as we've worked with the water quality boards, we've worked with the RCDs, NRCS, and those things to really come up with best management practices, you know, especially in the Laguna, because we know with the TMDL coming down, we still have to clean up the Laguna even more than what we've done in the last 20 years. So I think the agricultural people out there understand best management practices. You try and do the best that you can do. But sometimes, you know, the dollars aren't there, the equipment isn't there. Those are the struggles that we really have in agriculture. Sure, as Stuart said, you know, I mean, there's probably a lot of erosion control going on right now. That some of it is, you know, that you have to do it, but some of it is, if you look at some things, you know, some of the riparian corridor languages that were coming in through the county and this and that were so far overstepped that it was going to be, there was no way that, you know, certain agriculture commodities or practices were going to be able to do it. And when you looked at some of those lands, because they throw a big blanket over everything, it's not site specific. I think we can throw that blanket and 80% of the properties are already handled that way, but there are those sensitive areas that, you know, really need maybe a little bit more than best management practices. But from the people I work with, especially since most of the dairies here in Sonoma Marin County have gone organic, I think we've seen a huge difference in the way we handle pasture management, erosion, things like that, just because we know that we have to be able to keep that soil at its ultimate level to grow the grasses that we need to produce milk.
Thanks.
Alex, can I add something really quick?
Of course.
I just wanted to acknowledge folks like Doug and Stuart, because we get asked all the time about, you know, if we suggest management practices to landowners, but we aren't the experts, and so we're received that way, right? I think it's a little bit like, Misti, don't tell me how to manage my farm. But what I hear regularly from farmers and ranchers is if another, member of their agricultural community is brave enough to kind of take the step forward and modify their practices because of something they've seen, that is what facilitates change over time. And I have a dairy farmer I've been working with for years who says, like, everybody in the region's kind of watching the one person do the one thing, and then if it takes off and it works out and it pays off, because quite often the modification is incredibly expensive, then they'll try it out. But if I go out in the field and I'm like, hey, I hear that this is the new thing, it's not, I absolutely have no idea what I'm talking about. So it's not doesn't carry the same weight. So I really appreciate folks like yourselves who take the time to think through all the pieces and make modifications and then talk to your community about them.
Good point. Thank you, Misti. I'm not sure that there's a few questions in the chat, and I'm not sure that we'll have time for all of them, but I'm going to keep going down the list. The next one, I will admit I'm a little stumped for who to direct this to. I think that there probably a lot of folks have thoughts on this. The question is, what do you all think some of the major barriers are to broader audiences understanding the role ag plays, ag plays in land conservation and addressing climate change? And so I can just start with, I think one piece is having a really clear message about that. I think that the data on ag and climate change is still is really compelling, but still evolving. And a lot of it's very scientific, and it's hard to translate scientific information out to the public in a way that's interesting and exciting, even to people who are really interested in climate change. So I think that's one thing we all need to work on various fronts. But I'm not sure who to pass it to next, so I'm going to look and see who leans forward to talk about how we can increase understanding of ag's role in conservation and climate change. What do you guys think?
All right, I'll take the bait. I think you're right, Valerie. From my standpoint, we all have different views of what climate change is and where it's coming from and this and that. But from my standpoint, I don't have that expertise. I don't have that education to go out and speak to the community. I can sit and read. I can do things that we're seeing other farmers do, maybe in other areas of the world, other areas of the county. But when I sit and think about this county, and I think about the amount of, as Stuart was saying earlier, the reclaimed wastewater from the city of Santa Rosa, agriculture was the biggest user. Santa Rosa's reclaimed wastewater for agriculture was the biggest one, the number one in the world. And now we have gone a total different direction. We're not getting the amount of water that we used to. We're not going to be able to grow the amount of green grass to sequester carbon. So where's that breaking point that shoving water to the geysers to replenish steam fields to create energy, is that better than agriculture staying in business, irrigating pasture, growing green feed, and sequestering carbon? I mean, we have taken so much irrigation land away just off of the city-owned properties that was feed for dairy, beef, horse, everything in this area. Now I'm having to send trucks to Klamath Falls. The carbon footprint of so many more trucks leaving the area and coming into the area to bring me feed that used to be available right here in the county. So, we may think that creating green energy is the best way to do it, but I kind of look at it the other way when you start, so there's so many areas that contribute to climate change, but, with them not having the amount of water that that has been available for agriculture for the last 40 years, it's going to force me to go back to the ground and start pulling water out of the ground to continue my business the way it's run for the last 20 years. We saw it this year. We were on 3-day-a-week irrigation schedule this year, starting July 1. Think about irrigating your lawn 3 days a week and what it looks like. And I'm on an 18-day rotation with those cows. It was pretty tough to grow pasture. And now we get into the fire season, where other years we've had green pasture. We've kind of had that fire break for around our properties, and we were dry. And it's just been, it's been a real struggle this year, as Stuart was saying earlier about drought. But I think it's just, for me, I just don't have the experience or the expertise in that area to speak to what is best, but I can tell you what I've been doing and what I think works.
Well, Doug, I gotta say you don't have the experience and expertise, but you actually just raised a point that I have never thought of before about the climate benefits of water to the geysers versus climate benefits of using water in other places. So I think that just goes to show that even if that's not your formal training background, it takes all perspectives and all voices to raise the good questions that we need to answer about things like climate change. So I appreciate that. We have hit our end time, and so I'm just going to pass it back over to Allison to close us out. And before I do, thank you to the panelists for humoring me in my clumsy Zoom facilitation. It's harder to do this over Zoom than it is in person, so thank you for bearing with me, and to our lovely audience as well. And I'll hand it back to Allison.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Not clumsy at all. I thought you were wonderful. Thank you so much for moderating this conversation. You have the background that is so great for facilitating this conversation between all of our wonderful panelists. And thank you to all of you, Doug, Stuart, and Misti, for being here to have this conversation. I was fascinated. I've just learned so much, and I know that our audience did too. This is incredible. I mean, it's such valuable information to put out to our audience here at the Laguna Foundation. I know that I have a newfound appreciation for the thought and all of the practices that go into the work that you all are doing. So thank you for being here this evening. And yes, thank you to our audience for being here, for asking some great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of those this evening, but we appreciate your engagement and your participation in the way that you can with this webinar. You all are welcome to check the Laguna Foundation Community Education page for more opportunities, more webinars. There will be more. There's one more in December and more coming in January. So check back. We're always posting more. And these are the RCD and Ag and Open Space. They host other public outreach, public education events. They're pretty much all online right now. So you can check their websites as well for other opportunities to get this education that we were talking about in this webinar, and learn more about the role that each of these organizations play in increasing appreciation and public education about Sonoma County and the working and natural lands of the county. So thank you all for being here, and I will see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.